9 p.m. Eastern for the next 14 weeks, American History TV will spotlight the men who've served as Chief Executive of the United States. Tonight, we feature John Adams. This program is about 2.5 hours.
The man to whom the country is most indebted for the great measure of independency is Mr. John Adams of Boston. I call him the Atlas of American Independence. Richard Stockton, New Jersey, signer of the Declaration of Independence.
He means well for his country, is always an honest man, often a wise one, but sometimes, and in some things, absolutely out of his senses. Benjamin Franklin.
He stands nearly alone in the history of our public men in never having had his integrity called in question or even suspected. Benjamin Rush, Pennsylvania, signer of the Declaration of Independence.
Whether he is spiteful, playful, witty, kind, cold, drunk, sober, angry, easy, stiff, jealous, cautious, confident, closed, open, it is always in the wrong place or to the wrong person. James McHenry, War Secretary, Adams Administration.
John Adams could be loud, overbearing, and conceited, but he was also a brilliant statesman whose iron will kept the sometimes fickle and timid Continental Congress steadily on the path to independence. He was the nation's second president, serving one term from 1797 to 1801. He was the first chief executive to live in the White House, or President's House, as it was then called. But the residence, as Adams knew it, was unfurnished, bare-walled, and chilly in the winter months. He was a Unitarian who walked daily for exercise, used tobacco, and liked to fish. He was also an avid reader, often marking up the margins of his books with choice critical comments. He grew up the eldest of 3 boys in the countryside of eastern Massachusetts. He was a Harvard-educated lawyer by the time he began courting his third cousin, Abigail Smith. 9 years his junior, Abigail was a shy young woman of 17, in frail health, and like her new suitor, fascinated with the world of books. At this time, he was a stocky young man approaching 30, about 5'6", with blue eyes and brown hair that he covered with a powdered wig. Though his humble country origins rankled the sensibilities of his future mother-in-law, John Adams wed Abigail Smith in October of 1764. They had 5 children and were married 54 years. In letters, they called each other dearest friend. He was a discontented vice president under George Washington, calling the post, quote, the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived. Though in fits of pique he sometimes referred to the deeply revered Washington as Old Muttonhead, Adams thought the president should officially be addressed as His Highness, an idea that provoked much ridicule. Critics soon started calling the slightly overweight Adams his rotundity. He was 61 when he became president. His proudest achievement was keeping the nation out of war with France, but in part because most people supported such a conflict, his unpopularity persisted, and Thomas Jefferson, his vice president, soundly defeated him in the election of 1800. Adams left town at dawn on March 4, 1801, skipping his successor's inaugural, and returned to Massachusetts. He stayed active in retirement, working on an autobiography and corresponding with old friends from the Revolution, including Jefferson. When he was 89, he received news that his son, John Quincy, had been elected president. The next year, on July 4, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, he fell into a coma, emerging briefly to utter his final words, "Thomas Jefferson still survives." In fact, however, Jefferson had died earlier that same day. Adams died shortly thereafter from heart failure and pneumonia. He was 90.
Welcome to the second in our 41 programs on the American presidents. You're looking at the Adams Mansion, part of the Adams National Historic Park in Quincy, Massachusetts, just 8 miles south of Boston. We're going to learn more about John Adams as a person and his wife Abigail and the family and the stories by seeing the family home here in Quincy, Massachusetts, as well as the birthplaces and the grave sites and original writings. That's a portrait of John Adams in the dining room here at the Adams household. And our cameras are also outside, where you can see the home, and to the left of the home in the back, a library built by Charles Francis Adams in 1870 called the Stone Library. Our cameras are headquartered in that Stone Library, and we're going to be here for the next 2.5 hours. Our guests are going to include in this 2.5 hours David McCullough, author and historian. Talk about the Adams Mansion, the birthplaces, the letters of John and Abigail. Also John Stanwich. He's a supervisory park ranger with the Adams National Historic Park. And also joining us later will be Abigail Brown, one of the Adams descendants. David McCullough, here in the library with us. What drew you to John Adams?
Well, I was initially fascinated by the idea that these two extraordinary men, Jefferson and Adams, who were the driving forces really at Philadelphia in 1776 and the creation of the Declaration of Independence, became friends and then rivals and then enemies and then friends again, and then, as many of us know, died on the same day, and not just any old day, but on the 4th of July. 50 years to the day, 1826. And I thought that I would do a dual biography, in effect, and give them more or less equal time, how these crisscrossing lives intertwining, and then, of course, exiting at the same moment. And I was concerned at first that that as a writer, as someone trying to tell the story, I would be faced always with the problem of Jefferson upstaging Adams with the aura of Jefferson. And a friend of mine, Richard Ketchum, a very good biographer, said, "That's going to be the least of your worries." And once I got underway, I realized it was quite the reverse. That the man that I was drawn most to as a subject, the figure that is the most compelling story, was John Adams. Because he's an entirely human being. He's the only one of the founders who spilled out, told his whole story on paper. His own feelings, his own worries, his own opinions, and he had opinions on everything. He's a very great subject. He's a great man. He's a great American. Not perfect. He made mistakes. He had flaws. And he gave us one of the great families in American history. And I think you feel that here, particularly in this library, which isn't just a president's library. This is, maybe you might even call this the first presidential library, because this is the library of two presidents, John Adams and John Quincy Adams, but it's also the library of 4 generations of Adams family members, many of them extremely distinguished Americans, who've all lived here in the so-called old house next door and as part of this world, the world of books, of ideas, of generations, one after another, the sense of continuity, a very rare devotion to place that's not been the common denominator in American life. We're great movers on. The Adams didn't move on from this place. This is where they were. And everything in this library, everything in the house is real. It isn't just when you come here, you're coming to the home of 2 presidents, which is not possible anywhere else in the country, but you're coming into a world that is exactly the real thing. All of it is authentic. No Park Service guide here will point to a chair and say, well, that's the kind of chair they might have had. Or this is a desk similar to what probably was here. Everything here, pictures, rugs, furniture, books, are all the real thing. All these books around here are all the property where the adored possessions of John Adams, John Quincy Adams, Henry Adams, and their life of the mind permeated our whole story as Americans, which can all be told in the objects that are around here.
David McCullough lives close by over in Martha's Vineyard. He'll be with us for 2.5 hours. The phone lines are going to be open here very shortly. Let me give you some personal information on John Adams to bring you up to date on some background on this individual. He was born October the 30th, 1735 in Braintree, Massachusetts. He married Abigail Adams on October the 25th, 1764. He had 5 children: Abigail, John Quincy, Susanna, Charles, and Thomas. He was a Unitarian. He died July 4th, 1826 in Quincy, Massachusetts. And his career was 1770 to 1774 in the Massachusetts legislature. 1774 until 1777, he was a delegate to the Continental Congress. 1778 to 1788, he was a diplomat abroad. And from 1797 to 1801, he was the 2nd president of the United States. Right before that, he was vice president, as David McCullough said, for 8 years, 1789 to 1797. During the Adams administration, in 1798, Eli Whitney pioneers the use of the interchangeable parts. 1799 was the death of George Washington. 1800, Library of Congress established. Nation's capital moved to the District of Columbia. And John Chapman, Johnny Appleseed, plants a series of apple orchards in the American Midwest. And finally, in 1801, Ohio is the 17th state admitted to the Union. David McCullough, before we go any farther, when is that book of yours going to be out?
That's a difficult question for any writer ever to answer, but I would hope within the next 2 years.
In this room, 14,000 books, are some paintings. And we were looking earlier at some around the room. One of them is the painting of John Adams, back at the back. What can you tell us about that?
Well, that's a painting done when he was president. It certainly shows that he had, as we would say, a weight problem. He's wearing a ceremonial sword, which was not uncommon in those days. If you called on the French court at Versailles, for example, you were required to wear a ceremonial sword, and he had been an ambassador both in France and England and in Holland. So he knew what was expected. That, of course, went out of fashion very soon. I think what's interesting is many people come in to this library, I've been told, and think it's a painting of George Washington. Now, everybody who wore a wig then, as so many did, looked somewhat like George Washington because of that. But I think also either the artist or Mr. Adams or both thought it would be a good idea to look like George Washington. After all, he was filling the shoes of a man who was very nearly a god to Americans, who could have been king had he chosen. And to follow in the footsteps of George Washington was not an easy task. It would not have been an easy role for anybody.
How tall was he?
He was about 5'7", which was not short by the standards of the day, but it was short when compared to the two men that he came between, Jefferson and George Washington.
What was Abigail Adams like?
Ah, Brian. Abigail Adams is one of the most extraordinary of all Americans. She could hold her own with anybody in her own time and since. She was spirited, strong, idealistic, a force. Intellectually, she was at the forefront. She never went to school. She was too ill, and women very often weren't sent to school then. So she had no college education. She was a wonderful writer. She was a great reader. And she was in every way her partner, her husband's equal. And she was respected by all the men of her time that her husband worked with and knew. I think some of the most revealing letters that Thomas Jefferson ever wrote, revealing about his true innermost feelings, were written to her. Benjamin Rush, the great Philadelphia physician and signer of the Declaration of Independence, wrote to her and she to him. And the letters between John and Abigail Adams are some of the most marvelous letters in our American literature, and I call them literature. And they number in the hundreds, in the thousands, because they were separated for more than 10 years. And all that time they were writing back and forth to each other and talking about everything, about their family, about politics, about their innermost feelings, their fears, about illnesses, about the state of politics in Europe or the state of hometown doings here in what was then Braintree, now Quincy. And they were deeply in love with each other. And the devotion was total, lifelong, and it was the kind of love which is not just gazing at each other, but gazing out together in the same direction. She was an astute woman. She had very good judgment, good political judgment, better really in many ways than he did. And she knew his strengths, but she also understood his frailties. And he turned to her again and again. He really had a great deal of difficulty being away from her. He needed her, and part of the strain on him, and part of the story that one has to understand in order to appreciate the sacrifices he made for his duty, his sense of duty to his country, has to do with what he was giving up inwardly in his whole emotional life by being separated from her.
David McCullough, our guest, and we are at the Adams Historical Site. And by the way, those of you who are watching this live, the site is not open until April. So those of you who want to run out today, it's going to be closed. There's a lot of wind in this area anyway today and rain. It's a strange March day here in...
I think also that we're not seeing it today in bloom, so to speak. This garden that surrounds the library, and what is a lovelier image than a library in a garden? This library in the garden in the summertime is glorious.
You can see some videotape here from last summer.
And one of the, I know almost all the presidential sites, the homes of our presidents, and the feeling one has in visiting them. But there's nothing like this place because of this sense of generations and continuity. And the library, the stone library, which of course was built well after John Adams, the first president, was gone. And it's important too to understand that many people think of the Adams family and they rightfully think of this prominent, probably well-to-do, Harvard-educated, old New England family, aristocracy, New England blue bloods. Well, John Adams, the president, the second president of the United States, the signer of the Declaration of Independence, was a farmer's son. He was a simple farmer's son who went to Harvard on a scholarship, who went to Harvard when Harvard had all of 7 people on the faculty, and the total enrollment was maybe 100 students. Little, small. This was a tiny little country town outside of Boston, and Boston had a population of maybe 15,000 people. It's all on a very small scale. John Adams, like all New Englanders, grew up knowing that life was a battle. Survival in this climate was a battle.
We have our cameras in the panel room right inside the door when you come here, and you can see in there the, I believe, if we can show that now, please. Thank you. That tea set over there on the table is something that is authentic. Are you aware of this room?
Yes, that's Louisa Catherine Adams, John Quincy Adams' wife, brought that back. But if you move the camera over to the settee, which is in the room, this is the room paneled in Santo Domingo mahogany by the previous owner. This house, by the way, what they call the old house, is older than Mount Vernon. This house dates back to 1731. But I must stress that this is not the house that John Adams grew up in. This is not the house that John Adams lived in when he was riding off to Philadelphia. That was the other house, and the house in which John Quincy Adams was born in is another house which we'll be seeing shortly. This house they purchased, the Adams couple, Abigail and John Adams, purchased when they were in England, and when they returned from being ambassador to the court of St. James in 1788. And they moved into something larger than what they had before, but it was only half the size it is now. The house has been added on to by Abigail, and then added on to later. It's very interesting. Both Jefferson and Adams returned from being our first ambassadors to Europe, Jefferson to France and Adams to Great Britain, and doubled the sizes of their houses. They had gotten accustomed to living in those immense houses of Paris and London.
Let's look at that settee while you're talking about that, because you mentioned it earlier. They're in that same room.
All right.
What is the story behind that?
Well, the settee is a typical New England country settee, and that settee is where John Adams sat to have his portrait painted by Gilbert Stuart when he was in his nearly 90 years old, his late years. John Adams lived longer than any president we've ever had. He was the oldest president lived to be the oldest, 90 years old, nearly 91 years old. And if you could cut to the other room, to the painting of John Adams, is a nearly 90-year-old man, you'll see, here's the painting in this cut, but we also have it in the house itself. And in that painting, you see the ancient John Adams, this wonderful old man who was living here, sitting in the same settee. So there's the painting, there's the settee, and this, if you look at this gentleman, he's coming in on the hand, which is very poorly done, you'll notice, because it's a copy. This is a copy made by Gilbert Stuart's daughter, Jane. It's a very good copy, except for the handling of that hand. But he's holding a walking stick. And in a minute, he's going to show you the actual walking stick, I hope, in the little place there by the front door. Here we go. And so over there, in with the other walking sticks, is the original John Adams walking stick. So you see, we're not just talking about large objects or unconnected objects which are authentic. You have the chair in which he sat, the walking stick that he's holding in his hand.
Which one is it?
It's the large one in the foreground. And that painting, which we can either talk about now or later, is in my view, one of the most eloquent portraits ever done of a president.
Let me take a call first from Columbia, South Carolina. Go ahead, please. You're on with David McCullough.
Good morning.
Morning.
I'm very pleased that you're doing this special. I wanted to comment this morning and ask for your opinions, Mr. McCullough, about the comparison of intellectual prowess between Adams and Jefferson. Generally, Jefferson is seen to be, and called by many to be, the most brilliant president we had, and I've done quite a bit of study on the two, read their letters, and it seems to me that Adams was the mentor early on, and then Jefferson came into such prominence, his good looks, his height, his popularity, and it seemed like, to me, Adams was always trying to get Jefferson to a point where they were on equal footing again by, I'm sure you are very familiar with their letters, and Adams would write discussing various subjects from religion to politics to foreign affairs. And from my reading of those and my study of the two men, I would say that Jefferson probably wasn't our most brilliant president. I think actually John Quincy Adams was probably superior to the two, but I'd like your opinion on these things.
Thanks.
I think if it were possible to give all of the presidents of the United States an IQ test, that the highest score would be made by John Quincy Adams. I think he was the most brilliant American ever to occupy the office. I think between Jefferson and John Adams, you're in a way comparing apples and oranges. Jefferson's genius is real, it's protean, and it's elusive, and it's derivative, as much of all genius is, but he's borrowing all the time from architecture, from science, from literature, so forth. He is a more creative, his was the more creative mind, the more visionary, if you will. John Adams was, in my view, better read than Jefferson. I think he had a more powerful mind. I think he had a greater grasp and true understanding of the human condition than Jefferson did. I think also he was a more passionate man. In a way, they are wonderful opposites. Jefferson isn't just tall and lean and handsome. He's seemingly serene. He's contained. He's cool, aloof, and hard to know. Very hard to know. He won't ever argue with anyone if he can possibly avoid it. Adams is shorter, stouter. He's passionate. It's sort of a reverse of stereotypes. That it's the New Englander who's supposed to be cold and taciturn, who is eloquent and outspoken and hot-blooded, warm-blooded, passionate, explosive, vain, funny, humorous. He has a great, rich sense of life. It surges in him. And Jefferson, for all of his extraordinary attainments and admirable qualities, had very little sense of humor.
Not far from here are the birthplaces of both John Adams and John Quincy Adams, where people can visit if they come here. Have you been over there?
Oh, yes, and they are, to me, they are eloquent statements because they're so small, so humble in their way. You know, Thomas Jefferson was the great spokesman, the great voice of American democracy, the oracle of faith in the people, who lived about as far removed from the people as he could be on the top of his mountain. Adams is of the people. He lived, as you can see right there.
Which one was John Quincy Adams'
Now,
birthplace?
the birthplace of John Adams, the signer of the Declaration of Independence, the second president of the United States, is the house on the right. The house on the right was where John Adams was born and raised. His father, Deacon John Adams, was a farmer and a deacon in the church. And as you see, it's right by, the wall is right on the road, and the house is right by the wall. When the army marched by in the street or a wagon went by, the dust would blow into the windows of the kitchen. These were people who lived among the people. And Adams is the person who, in effect, says, you got to watch out for the common man. I know, I'm one of them. And the common man, if he gets more power than he should have, can be just as dangerous as any other kind of power that's too great. That's where John Quincy Adams was born.
Where they move across?
And he moved next door. When he and Abigail were married, they moved into that house, and both houses belonging to the Adams family, to the father, who is by then deceased. Now you see it in this wonderful painting. John Adams, the second president, was born in the house to the right, and John Adams, when he married Abigail Adams, moved into the house on the left, and John Quincy Adams and their other children were born in that house.
Ada, Oklahoma, you're next with David McCullough. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Thank you very much. Mr. McCullough, first, my compliments to you, sir, for a fine narrative on the Civil War series by Ken Burns.
Thank you very much.
My second thing is thank you for helping to save Manassas battlefield from development. And I'd like to ask an observation and a question. I read in the book Liberty by Thomas Fleming that after the war, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams went to England to receive court by George III. And George III was very taken with John Adams, considered him chivalrous, well-spoken and a good sense of humor. And on the other hand, George III snubbed Thomas Jefferson, I guess because he did author the Declaration of Independence. And I found it interesting to notice that right after the war, John Adams would go to England to receive court with George III. My question for you, sir, is what was the relationship between the early presidents and England after the war and before the War of 1812? Because not much is mentioned in this historical aspect. And I look forward to your comments, and thank you for this fine series.
John Adams and the King got on quite well, just as you said. It was always in a court situation, generally formal. The first presentation of the new ambassador to the court of St. James, the new American ambassador, was one of the great scenes, one of the great moments, in my view, in the history of our country. And both of these men, who were about the same age, and in many ways quite similar, found it a very stirring, moving moment. Found it difficult to speak. Former enemies greeting each other, and the King, of course, greeting the ambassador to the new independent United States of America. When Jefferson came to England after John Adams became ambassador to the court of St. James, John Adams arranged for Jefferson to meet the King. Now, it's come down that the King snubbed Jefferson. It's almost certain that that never happened. Jefferson wrote later that the King treated him rudely, but he wrote this long after the fact, as an older man, as an old man. And he didn't like the British, and he was sure the King didn't like him, and it appears, colored this scene a little more strongly than he should have. And John Adams' grandson, in writing a biography of his grandfather, said that the King had snubbed Jefferson. Well, if the King had snubbed Jefferson, John Adams, would have hit the ceiling. He would have hit the ceiling in fact, or he would have written about it at length in his journals or his private correspondence. There is no indication in anything that anybody wrote at the time, any witnesses to this scene, and there are many people there, nothing in the paper, so it probably didn't happen. However, the overall relations with Great Britain after the Revolutionary War were cool and remain cool. The British were not about to do much to help this new United States of America succeed, and trade relations were the real issue, and the British were in no great hurry to equalize or to make possible a thriving economy here. So that this country, our new country, was in those first days, those first years, poor, powerless, without clear-cut notion of what was going to happen or what kind of government was eventually going to evolve. It was a very uncertain, very dangerous time, and it's fortunate that it came out the way it did.
David McCullough is with us in the Stone Library, which was built in 1870 by Charles Francis Adams here on the Adams property in Quincy, Massachusetts. This is the second of 41 stops for us, looking at 41 men who were president of the United States. We have a call from Buffalo, New York, but before I ask the Buffalo caller what they want to ask you, John Quincy Adams was his son. Who was famous that was a son of John Quincy Adams?
Charles Francis Adams. And Charles Francis Adams was our ambassador to Great Britain during the Civil War and performed an immensely important service, among other things, keeping Britain out of the war during the Civil War.
Was he ever elected to Congress?
I think he was, yes.
What about his son?
Another Charles Francis Adams. But they had several sons. But the sort of the historic figures, another Charles Francis, and a Henry Adams. Henry Adams, of course, maybe the greatest historian we've ever had.
And Brooks Adams comes from what?
Yeah, same, this
son of?
Great-grandson, yeah.
Let's take a call from Buffalo, New York. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Brian, you've outdone yourself again. Thank you. I'm enjoying the series very, very much. I'm curious on the relationship between John Adams and George Washington. prior to George Washington's presidency and how they became, friends, and obviously they had to be to go through what they had gone through, and that's my curiosity. Thanks.
John Adams did a great deal beyond being President of the United States. And in some ways, his presidency might not even be the most important part of his contribution to history and to the country. One of the most important things he did was to stand up in the Continental Congress and recommend, strongly urge, that George Washington, the Virginian George Washington, be put in command of the Continental Army. He really deserves more credit for that, I think, than he has received. He is also the one, when he was asked to write the Declaration of Independence, insisted that it should be Jefferson to write the Declaration of Independence. And when he was president, for the last days of his presidency, he appointed John Marshall Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So as nothing but a casting director, if you will, he did brilliantly. Washington, Jefferson, and John Marshall. But Adams' respect for George Washington was very great indeed. He did not, however, see him as perfect. He did not see him as flawless. He didn't see him as a god, and he disapproved of anybody seeing anyone as a god. And so sometimes he was critical of Washington, and critical of Washington even when Washington was president, at least privately. He recognized Washington's strengths. He recognized, for example, that part of Washington's effect on people was his gravitas, was the fact that he was often very quiet and calm and didn't say much at all, which Adams was almost incapable of. Adams had to speak up about everything, and he wished he could be like George Washington, and said so very often.
If John Adams were here today, what label would he most likely have on him politically?
Independent.
He would not be a Democrat or Republican?
He detested parties. He detested factions. He was an independent man, which was both his strength and his weakness.
What about his son, John Quincy?
Exactly the same. Exactly the same. They thought that devotion to party should come secondary to devotion to country. And they saw too many people doing things for their political advantage or their party advantage that were not in the best interests of the country, in their opinion. But that makes it difficult for them to work with coalitions and parties, because they're going to speak their mind no matter what.
Numbers to call: 202-624-1111 if you live in the Eastern and Central time zones. Some lines are open. And 202-624-1115 if you live in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. Would you like to have a library like this?
I would give anything to have a library like this. I used to think, until I came in here, I wanted to have Henry Higgins' library in My Fair Lady, with one of those little stairways that you would go up to the balcony. But this, I think, is one of the most wonderful spaces in America. The scale of it's so beautiful, and of course the books around the walls are all, each one is a treasure. There's one book here that's about that big. It's in Latin, and John Adams wrote in the flyleaf to his grandson, I believe it was, "I give you this book, which is worth more than a gold watch studded with diamonds." And that's the way he felt, that the real treasures of life, the real value was in what's in the pages of these books. Those founders all believed to their boots that whether or not this trial, this experiment of democracy, of a republic, was going to work depended on the education of the people. And right over here, in the corner, over here, if we could turn to that marvelous little desk, that simple wooden pine desk, is one of the treasures in American life. At that desk, that's the stand-up working desk of John Adams, which was in his law office in one of the houses we just saw on camera, the other Adams houses here in Quincy. At that desk was written by John Adams the oldest Constitution still in use anywhere in the world, the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which was written 10 years before the national Constitution. It's still the law of this state. It was written at that desk, and it's virtually the same in its fundamental respects to the Constitution of the United States.
Daly City, California, you're on with David McCullough. Go ahead, please.
Oh, good morning, Mr. McCullough. I wanted to ask your thoughts on what John Adams felt when Thomas Jefferson was arriving in Paris to join him as minister to France, and also your thoughts on what really started the rift between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Was it one particular incident, or was it a culmination of incidents? And one third question I was thinking, what was John Adams's, I just kind of lost it. This is my first time calling. John Adams, in my readings, I discovered that he tried to take a responsibility for the writing of the Declaration of Independence. And can you comment on that, please? Thank you very much.
Well, he never tried to take responsibility for the writing of the Declaration of Independence. What he did, and why he is so important, is he drove the Declaration of Independence through the Congress, got the Congress to vote for independence at a time when that was by no means going a certain outcome. And he got them to do it when they did it. If they had delayed another few weeks, it might not have happened, because the British had just landed. Those first few days in July, the British were landing 32,000 troops on Staten Island in New York. That was more troops than the entire population of Philadelphia, the largest city in the country at that point. And so he was summoning their courage to do this. And when they were pledging their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor, that wonderful line at the end of the Declaration of Independence, that wasn't just rhetoric. Those weren't just words. Their lives were really on the line, and he's the one that more than any other person was responsible for the passage of the Declaration of Independence. Now, in the creation of the Declaration of Independence, working with Jefferson in particular, he and Jefferson came to have great respect for one another. Now, there was a substantial age difference. Adams was older by 8 years. Jefferson was still in his early 30s and looked to Adams as the older, more experienced man, and he was a more experienced man. But their friendship was off to a very good start, and when Jefferson arrived in Paris after the end of the Revolutionary War eventually to become our minister in Paris, replacing Franklin, Adams was delighted to have him there. He said late in his life, "I always loved Jefferson," and he really did love Jefferson. Adams was not a man reluctant to express his affections, his love for people, and his pleasure in their company. He counted friendship one of the highest attainments of life, and he meant it all of his life. So what made their breakup all the more poignant, all the more heartrending for both of them, but particularly for John Adams, was the importance of that friendship to him. Now it evolved out of several things, but in a way it evolves primarily out of politics, but they saw the French Revolution in distinctly different ways. Now this is simplification, but in general this is how it should be understood, it seems to me. Jefferson, the visionary, the great philosopher of democracy, pure democracy, saw the French Revolution as the extension of the American Revolution, which many people did, if not most people, in the early stages of the French Revolution. And he looked at it in a very idealistic, heartening fashion. Adams was worried about it. Adams saw it as dangerous and possibly brutal, which of course is what happened. It turned and became horrible. Much more atrocious, much more of a bloodbath than even we realize. The guillotine and the execution of the aristocracy that went on in Paris was only part of it. what was even more atrocious were the horrible atrocities committed in the provinces. Now, Adams and Jefferson knew many of those people, and Jefferson, in a way, it was too terrible for him to accept at first, and that bothered Adams a lot, and it bothered Abigail a great deal. They also had differences in politics in this country after they had returned and become involved with the new George Washington administration. But even then, somehow or other, the friendship survived. Crucial to all of it was that the press in that time was often supported financially by the two political parties. And Adams knew that the Republicans, as the Democrats were then known, were paying and supporting the press that was attacking him savagely. And in fact, Jefferson had loaned money, or actually given money, it's not altogether clear, to one of the most hostile of these writers, political writers, a man named Callender. And when Abigail found that out, that Jefferson was perhaps behind this attack artist, that was something that just broke her heart, and she never really got over. She was a lot longer in forgiving Jefferson than her husband was. But the wonderful thing is that after they finished politics, after they had each retired to his respective home at Monticello and here in Quincy, these two great men, these two great former friends, had a reconciliation through their mutual friend Benjamin Rush, the Philadelphia physician, and then commenced in 1812 one of the great exchanges of letters, some of the greatest correspondence in all of American literature, which went on until their deaths in 1826.
We'll talk some more about that and look at the desk where some of those letters are written before this program's over. Evansville, Indiana, thanks for waiting. We'll go to John Stanwich right after this. Go ahead, Evansville.
Yes, I noticed that you said that John Adams was a Unitarian. I used to live in the D.C. area, and I would visit both Monticello and Mount Vernon. I've actually attended church in the Episcopalian church that George Washington attended in Alexandria, and it makes me think about the civic morality, the standards of civic morality that existed in all of those coastal cities at that time, and where we've come from there. And basically what I'd like to know is, do you think there is a culture war taking place in this country? And if so, where would these men have fallen down on it? On which side would they have fallen down in the culture wars regarding the denigration of cultural standards that we see all over the place in this country?
Thanks, Evansville. David McCullough.
Well, without even suggesting that I'm defending what's happening in large parts of our way of life and our culture, the country has always been going to the dogs. It was then, and it was year after year in the eyes of many people ever since, right up to the present day. I think it's very important to understand the immense difference between the 18th century and our present day. It was a different time. It was a different world, a different culture, and we're all influenced by the ecology, if you will, of the culture we live in. Public virtue, one's duty as a citizen, one's behavior in society by moral law, ethical tradition, was a deeply felt, it permeated everything. The church is right up the street here. The town meetings were held in the church. we talk about separation of church and state, which of course is one of Jefferson's greatest accomplishments and must never, ever be forgotten. But church and state were never divided in the minds or the hearts, or if you will, the souls of those people. And John Adams is a superb example of that. John Adams was a deeply religious man. He was, but he wasn't a pious man of the kind that sort of wears his piety on his lapel. He believed that the essence of life were to be found in the Ten Commandments and the Sermon on the Mount. He believed in a God. He believed in life after death. He believed in doing unto others as one would do unto one's self. He believed in forgiveness and mercy. He was as honest as anybody I have ever read about. He was called Honest John Adams, and that wasn't sarcasm. This is probably as good a place as any to talk about the famous letter that he wrote to Abigail when he first went into the White House. He was the first president to occupy the White House. And he arrived at the White House in the autumn of 1801. Presidency, the capital had been in Philadelphia. And he got there, and the place was unfinished. Only half the rooms had been finished. There was wet plaster everywhere. It smelled of wet plaster and wet paint. And there were some workmen around, and the architects were in the building. They knew the president was coming sometime or other, and they looked out the window, and there he was, arriving in a coach with one servant following on a horse. And he came in. He had a supper in the house. The stairways hadn't been finished. There was just one curving service stairway, narrow service stairway that went up to the living quarters. He climbed the stairs that night with a candle and went to bed. And the next morning he came down and wrote a letter to Abigail in which he said that, "Let us pray that none but wise and honest men will ever rule here." And that line has been carved into the mantelpiece of the state dining room at the White House. It was put there by Franklin Roosevelt. And when Harry Truman was president, the White House had to be redone, and he made certain that that line stayed cut into the marble of the fireplace. And there it is today, right beneath, I think very appropriately, the great Healy portrait of Abraham Lincoln.
On the porch at the Adams home here in Quincy, Massachusetts, is John Stanwich, who is a supervisory park ranger. Good morning, Mr. Stanwich.
Good morning, Brian.
Is it cold out there this morning? It looks like it's a bit windy.
Not as cold as it is windy and rainy out here.
Tell us about this house.
Well, first I'd like to welcome not only you, Brian, but David and all your C-SPAN viewers here. Right now I'm standing in front of what we call today the Old House. Some folks refer to as the Adams Mansion, and John Adams referred to as Peacefield. It was the home to 4 generations of the Adams family. John Adams moved in with Abigail in 1788. After John Adams lived here, his son John Quincy and his wife Louisa Catherine lived here. After them, their son Charles Francis Adams would reside here. And then finally, the home would be in the care of Brooks Adams, who decided to, when he died, leave this home to a group of his nephews and nieces to take care of and to show to the public to instill civic virtue and patriotism in future generations.
How many people John Stanwich visit here every year?
Last year we had 65,000 people who came to witness the Adams family story here at the Adams National Historical Park. And usually we have at least that many people who come here on an annual basis to not only view this home, but also to the 2 birthplace homes of the presidents. John Adams' birthplace home is about a mile south of where I'm standing right now. And right next to it is the birthplace home of his son, President John Quincy Adams. And it's the only place in America where he can so conveniently visit 2 presidential birthplace homes. They were the only father and son presidential team, and they are the 2 oldest birthplaces of presidents in the country, so a very unique and remarkable site in its own right.
Why the scaffolding alongside the John Quincy Adams birthplace home?
As I said, the home is a very old one. That home in particular goes back to 1663. With any old home, there's constant care and maintenance. The National Park Service, who is entrusted with preserving and protecting and interpreting that structure, maintains a constant vigilance over the structure and makes sure that it stays in fine condition so that visitors can experience it. And so it's a constant and ongoing project to make sure that it remains the way that the Adams left it to the American people.
Stay where you are. I want to grab a call from Houston, Texas. Go ahead, Houston. You're on the air. What would you like to talk about?
Yes, I'd like to ask a question. It's a pretty hot topic heading into this next primary session for the presidential campaign. But we have a candidate like Pat Buchanan that's exclusively talking about world government and independence. And I'd like to know what the historian would think about us giving up our independence and our sovereignty to a world institution like the UN with these trade agreements and expansion of NATO and all these different tentacles, so to speak, that's engulfing this country into world government. And I'd like, because I remember you saying that Adams had said on the 50th anniversary, independence forever. And I'd like to get the historian's viewpoint about that.
Thanks for the call. Loaded question for you there, Mr. McCall?
Oh, sure. I think there's very little chance that we will ever give up our independence. And we do live in a smaller, more complicated, and more dangerous world in many ways than it was then. But it's a great mistake to think that somehow or other, in times past, life was simpler, or that politics was simpler, or that international relations were simpler. They were different, not simpler. And if we have people who are concerned that maybe we're giving up some of our independence, we've always had that concern. We've always been afraid of dangerous entangling alliances. This is an old theme in American life and always will be.
We're at the Adams Historical Park in Quincy, Massachusetts. John Stanwich, how far are we from Boston and how hard is it to get here?
Well, today it's about 8 miles south of Boston. If John Adams had left his home shortly after he moved here, it would have been about 12 miles because he would have had to go through Milton. Today there's a bridge that spans the Neponset River and makes it much easier and convenient for visitors to make their way down from Boston here. We're located right near most forms of public transportation. An interstate passes not a mile west of us here, and also too, the Metropolitan Boston Transit Authority has a subway line that runs to Quincy Center where visitors can make it very convenient to come down here to experience the Adams family story.
What does it cost to visit?
Well, that's the best thing. It's $2 this year to visit the Adams family, the Adams National Historical Park. That allows visitors to board a trolley bus at our visitor center and travel down to the two birthplace homes to hear about John Adams' young life there at the home that he said formed his character and his ideas. And then shortly after visiting that birthplace home of John Adams, walk right next door to hear about the Adams family story during the time of the American Revolution, of Abigail penning her famous correspondence from that home, of John Adams coming back during the war to draft the Massachusetts Constitution. And then they can board the trolley bus after hearing that up to this location, the Adams family mansion, to hear about 4 generations of a family who gave their lives to public service. And all the original artifacts are inside to help National Park Rangers interpret the story to really make this story so relevant to people today.
How many people work for the Adams Historical Park from the National Park Service?
Today, approximately 30 National Park Service employees man the staff of Adams National Historical Park. A good portion of those are seasonal employees who come here during our season, which is April 19th to November 10th, to provide visitor services and interpretation of the historic resources.
And where are you from originally?
I'm actually from the Commonwealth of Virginia, so I hope the viewers don't mind hearing Yankee history from a Virginian, but I'll try to be as fair and as honest as John Adams was.
How long have you been here?
I've been here for 7 years.
How much does it cost the taxpayer to maintain this place for a year?
Our annual budget is approximately $1.4 million. And that provides not only the care and maintenance and salaries of those employed here, but we also too, through the National Park Service, also manage a cultural resource center that is located in Boston and that we hope in the very near future to move down here to Quincy so that they can provide us ongoing knowledge and expertise and a knowledge base of the remarkable collection of artifacts that now are inside the home, so people can really get to know more about the public and private lives of this family within this remarkable setting.
Thank you, John Stanwich, for joining us, and thanks for having us here.
Well, thank you, and I really like to thank all of you for making this so vivid for the viewers and really bearing homage to this wonderful story that we enjoy here.
Those of you watching, and if you're noticing some transmission problems, just about the time we went on the air, the fierce storm came through here, which we knew was going to happen. It was calm here overnight, and so you're going to see from time to time maybe some sparklies on your screen. Bloom,
I think that weather is very appropriate. This is New England. This is a harsh climate. Certainly can be a harsh, and it can be an unexpected climate. And that New England setting has to be taken into consideration when understanding what kind of people these were. You know, it's very easy to say, oh, they were stiff Puritans and so forth. Well, you know, they weren't really Puritans. My friend Peter Drummey at the Massachusetts Historical Society says even the Puritans weren't Puritans. But you had to have resilience. You had to have backbone. You had to be able to ride out the storm, to survive here as farmers. And John, keep in mind that when John Adams was born, when John Adams was growing up, when he rode away to Philadelphia to attend the Congress there, he was the fifth generation. There were four generations before him in this town, before there was ever what we call the United States of America. So he wasn't just John Adams of Braintree as a figure of speech. This was in him. It was part of him.
Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania, for David McCullough. Go ahead, please.
Dr. McCullough, among my Revolutionary War collection that arrived with the family, I have a ship's gunner's powder flask made for Lieutenant Joseph Adams aboard Brig Lively, 1766. And the Brig Lively I was able to identify. I found a flock of Joseph Adams going back to the original Adams that came to this country from Great Britain. Among the Joseph Adams, I have one, beside on this powder flask, I have one who was in the Revolutionary Navy. Apparently, he also was in the Penobscot Bay fiasco. And then he disappears. The only Joseph Adams I can find is one that is listed as being provided for by his father because he was blind, but he was also a poet. And my dream has always been to find more about this man who seems to epitomize the Adams family and daring do in the past from their first ancestor who was a ship's captain.
Thanks, caller. David McCullough?
Well, that's wonderful. How exciting. I have a very strong feeling that if you contact the Massachusetts Historical Society, or better still, come here to the Massachusetts Historical Society, which is one of the great collections in the whole country, you will find your man. You will find a great deal about him. Now, the first Adams to arrive was known as Henry Adams, and he was a farmer and a maltster. The Adamses were mostly all maltsters. They made malt for yeast and for beer. It was what they had done in England, in Somerset County, where they all came from in England. And that Henry Adams, who was the first to arrive in Braintree, had 89 grandchildren. And so you can see there are a lot of Adams. But they left their traces, and They were by and large, of course, people who were unknown to history. John Adams was the first member of his family to leave New England, for example. No Adams had ever been as far away as, unimaginably far away as Philadelphia. Abigail Adams had never been, before she sailed for England after the Revolutionary War, had never been much farther away than Haverhill, Massachusetts, or Salem from her town here. But they were a resolute group, and it's just extraordinary what they did. I think it would be hard to find an American family that contributed it as much, and who, as we just heard, who devoted so much of their lives to service to the country, and were so able, so talented. You know, you open up John Quincy Adams' diaries, for example, which I know you're going to be seeing when you do him at the Mass Historical Society, and they're that big, and they're every day he was writing down his thoughts, his philosophy, his views on what was happening in the Congress or what was happening in his own life, and they're like beautiful essays with scarcely a word crossed out or a line changed. If he had done nothing else but write that diary, you'd have to say, who was this amazing man? If that had been all he had ever done.
Paul Nagel told us when we did the book note show with him that reading the diary on microfilm was 9 miles long. and he had read it all.
I don't.
John Quincy Adams' desk that he used in Statuary Hall at the Capitol is sitting right over here in this room.
Yes.
Those of you who have just joined us, this is the second of 41 stops that we're going to make in our series covering the American presidents. We're calling it American Presidents Life Portraits. We're in the Stone Library here at the Adams property in Quincy, Massachusetts. Both John Adams and John Quincy Adams born in this town. And one of the main reasons we do this is for education. We want to make sure that those of you who are teachers and want to get involved in this and want our lesson plans and student guides and all that can call our C-SPAN in the Classroom telephone number. It's there on the screen right now. It's 202-626-4858. And above that is our website address. You can actually enroll in C-SPAN in the Classroom to this website at cspan.org/classroom. 202-626-4858. Material there on the right. Actually, that picture right in the middle is a very young Harry Truman. I'm sure David McCullough has seen that photograph before. Those are a number of presidents on that page there. And that's cspan.org/classroom. Do you know how many copies of Harry Truman, hardback and softback, have now sold that you wrote a couple years ago?
No, I don't. It's well over 1 million. I know that.
Was that your bestseller?
By far.
You've had 4 other books besides that one?
5.
And tell us about
I'm writing my 7th book now.
The first book you ever wrote
was the Johnstown Flood.
What year?
Well, it was published in 1968. Still in print. I think of what I'm proud of in life, most of all my family, but that all my books are still in print. And Johnstown Flood was published 31 years ago this month. That was followed by The Great Bridge, about the building of the Brooklyn Bridge. And after that was The Path Between the Seas, about the creation of the Panama Canal. And that was followed by Mornings on Horseback, which is the story of the life of young Theodore Roosevelt. And then I published a collection of shorter essays, pieces, called Brave Companions. And after that came Truman, and now I'm doing John and Abigail Adams.
How long a book will this be on John?
I don't know. It won't be as long as the Truman book.
And why is that?
Too heavy. You know, when I was writing the Truman book, I was very concerned about how long it was getting, and my editor, Michael Korda, said, don't worry about that. It's a big subject. Make it a big book. So that's what happened.
Amy Lassiter is on our phone right now. She's a sophomore at John Adams High School in South Bend, Indiana. Amy Lassiter, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hi.
Good morning.
Good morning to you.
Why do you think they named your high school after John Adams?
Actually, there's a specific story about that. there was a school board member at the time named Lawrence Harwood, and he apparently studied John Adams. And there's a school very close to Adams called Jefferson, and it's an elementary school right now, but at the time it was a junior high school. And Mr. Harwood suggested that because Jefferson and Adams were rivals and then later friends, it would be appropriate for the high school to name John Adams.
What have you learned in all this business about John Adams as you studied history?
Well, I guess the thing that stood out most was that he was really a man ahead of his time. He was really sort of modern. He looked out for the minorities. He looked out for women. He treated his wife as an equal, and he stood up for principle even when it wasn't a popular thing to do.
Are you interested in history?
Well, yes, it's not my favorite subject, but yeah, I like it a lot.
I have a picture here of your high school. Tell us about it in South Bend, Indiana.
Oh, wow. Well, it opened first in 1940, and it had a lot of additions on there. And so, well, it's the oldest high school in our school system, and we're really proud of it. They tried to close it a while ago, but we have such great school pride, and we're really successful in everything that they couldn't do it. It was really great.
How interested do you find your fellow students there at John Adams High School in South Bend interested in history?
Well, of course, there are a lot of variations, but I think just about everybody at the school, at least, is interested in learning, and so by extension, everyone likes history.
And what year are you?
I'm a sophomore.
What do you plan to do after high school?
Well, I'm really interested in science. I'm probably going to go into research, and if not that, then probably forensic pathology, but I'm not really sure yet.
Thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Our next call for David McCullough is from St. Louis, Missouri. Go ahead, please.
Hello, Brian. Bravo to you and to C-SPAN.
Welcome.
Mr. McCullough, please explain the differences between the political parties as they existed at that time. You mentioned that Jefferson was a Republican, which became the Democratic Party. Could you take the confusion out of all this and tie it to the Federalist Papers and Madison and Hamilton, please?
Well, yes, the opposition party, the Federalist Party, which was Adams' party, as much as he could bring himself to be a party man, goes out of business, becomes extinct after. I've got a problem here. Becomes extinct after Adams is defeated in his attempt to be reelected for a second term. In general, the Federalists were for a stronger federal government. They believed that the power of the federal government was essential to maintain the union of the 13 different states. And this is a simplification, of course, but the Republicans, or the Democrats, which was Jefferson's party, which is now the oldest political party in the world, were more concerned about the individual rights and powers of the various states. And this was a genuine issue. Of course, it's the issue over which, in part, a war will be fought, the Civil War. And the seeds of the Civil War are all to be found right in this very time, with both slavery and the issue of states' rights. I think it's important to point out that John Adams was one of the few founding fathers who did not have slaves. He never had slaves on principle. John Hancock had slaves at one point. Sam Adams was given a slave and gave her freedom eventually, pretty quickly. But Franklin had slaves at one point. And of course Washington and Jefferson and the Virginians were major slaveholders. But Adams had no slaves, nor would he hire slaves, as New Englanders often did. There weren't very many slaves in Massachusetts in general, but Adams was opposed to it, and Abigail was adamantly opposed to slavery. And one of the most provocative and, to me, arresting moments in all of her correspondence is when she asks John Adams, who is off in Philadelphia, whether all of this travail, the disease, war, pestilence, might be descending on the country because of the sin of slavery.
Milwaukee, Oregon, for David McCullough. Good morning.
Yes, good morning.
I can't.
I was much taken by that library. It reminds me very much of one that my father-in-law he had in Marietta, Maryland. It was the name of the estate was Marietta, and the law library was just tucked off to one side. And when I was courting one of his daughters, I visited there. I eventually married her, and spent some time in the law library. I was just really impressed with it as being a unique structure, and didn't realize at the time I was there how historic the place was. Marietta, the new wing was built in 1803, so it gives you an idea. And I just wondered if David had ever visited that library.
Well, no, I have not. I'm from that part of the country, pretty close at least. I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I love libraries, public libraries, private libraries, university libraries. I depend on libraries and librarians for my work. And if you can understand people by what they love, the Adams all loved books. And John Adams, who had very little material interest, he wasn't an acquisitive person. He didn't want fine clothes or a fancy house, or he wasn't much for that, and he never had much money. That's a very important point. You know, George Washington was an extremely wealthy man. Thomas Jefferson lived like a wealthy man, though he was always in debt. Adams was never in debt, largely because of Abigail, so it would never tolerate any such state of existence. But whatever money he had, he spent on books. And his actual library, his great collection, this collection here is mostly the collection of John Quincy Adams, though there are many books here that belong to John Adams, the father. But the John Adams books, which number over 2,000, are all in the Boston Public Library. So anyone who comes to the Adams site here in Quincy and is interested in the Adams family and the Adams life of the mind, by all means should go to see the Adams collection at the Public Library, which is beautifully displayed behind glass cases in a separate room. You know, when John Quincy Adams came back from living with his family in Paris to enter Harvard as a teenage young man, he landed in New York, and he traveled north to get home to Quincy and to Boston, to Cambridge for college. And he stopped at Yale to visit Yale because he'd never seen it. And he was taken to see the Yale College library. And he wrote afterward to his father that he was very interested in seeing the Yale library, but it wasn't anything compared to his father's own library. So the preciousness of books, the idea that books were the most valuable of possessions and ought to be passed on, that you would have a building devoted to books, is really an expression of an attitude toward life. And I think that's one of the feelings that one takes away from a visit to this marvelous place.
David McCullough, located here in the Stone Library, built by Charles Francis Adams in 1870. And the telephone numbers, for those of you who want to join us, are 624-1111. That's an area code of 202. And 202-624-1115 for those that live in the Mountain and Pacific time zone. We have a camera in what's called the Long Room, and I know you have a story to tell, David McCullough, about Nabby. Smith, who was, I guess, Nabby Adams, and there's a portrait in that room, I believe, of her.
Well, that's what we're looking at just then. That was Abigail, a Gilbert Stuart painting of Abigail Adams as First Lady, and one of the great Americans. I would give a great deal to have known her, to just spend an hour talking with her. She's the one who, you know, when her husband was in Philadelphia at the time of the Declaration of Independence, who wrote the famous letter in which she said, when you're working there about creating freedom and independence, don't forget the ladies, don't forget women. And her sense of right and wrong, her sense of duty, sending her 10-year-old son, her oldest son, with her husband off to France in the dead of winter on the North Atlantic in a American frigate in 1778, because she knew that he would have to serve his country, and that what he would learn on this trip, what he would take away from the experience, was of infinitely greater value than anything he would ever learn in books. And bucking him up, giving him a speech, as it were, about why he must go and do this. She is really, one can take great heart from reading what she had to say.
We'll get your Nabby story in just a moment because we have the portrait in that room. Westerly, Rhode Island, for David McCullough. Go ahead, please.
Good morning. My name's Marjorie Adams Cook, and I'm a descendant of one of those many great-grandchildren that you mentioned. I have read all of Mr. McCullough's books. I've kept them all. If I have any Adams traits, it is my love of books. But I have two questions. Number one, that famous letter that you just mentioned by Abigail about the ladies. Is it on display at the Quincy Library or anywhere else? I've read it. I've read many of the letters, and I'd like to see some of them.
Let me just ask before you answer. Have you ever been here?
No, isn't that silly? I live so nearby, but I work full-time. It's, you know, it's one of those things you always put off. But now that I've seen the program, now I'm really spurred on.
What has it meant to you being an Adams descendant?
Oh, it's a burden. Because you can never accomplish what they accomplished. But my great-great-grandfather wrote textbooks, wrote school books, and he went to Dartmouth Medical School, and my great-grandfather was the first president of the first officially organized baseball team in this country. So it's a grand heritage, but as Plutarch says, the glory belongs to the ancestors, not ourselves. So I have a question about the letters, and then also about his book on the Panama Canal.
Go ahead with that question while we still have you.
On the letters. I'd like to know, since I've read all his books. So first of all, I want to know when the Adams book is coming out. I can't wait. But on the book on the Panama Canal, how does he feel now that we are handing it off after all that this country went through to build it and keep it and protect it and pay for it?
Thanks, caller.
Thank you.
On the Panama Canal, I think that the decision to the essence of the treaties was the right decision because the real point is to keep the canal in operation, and to have had that kind of political contention and the enormous risk of real trouble in Panama over the future of the canal, had we insisted on maintaining complete control of it, was greater than the returns might have been. It's by no means certain that all is going to work well, but that's never really certain about anything. I think that a great deal rests on the shoulders of Panama in the coming century, and we'll see how they do. But of course, to no country is the canal more important than to Panama as a source of revenue, a source of pride, identity, and it's hard to imagine that anyone in position of responsibility there would be so foolish as to do anything detrimental about the canal. As for the papers of the Abigail Adams and family, they are all in the Massachusetts Historical Society, and I have no doubt whatsoever that if you went there, they would love to welcome an Adams and love to show whatever it is you would wish to see. But keep in mind that all of these papers number in the thousands. It's beyond belief. You said you were working Well, that's very much of an Adams tradition. They were workers. Oh my, did they work. They were up at 5 o'clock every morning like farmers all of their lives. These were people who pruned their own trees, who saddled their own horse, Abigail made her own butter and did their own cooking and made the clothes. And that's part of independence. Now, they weren't in isolation here in Braintree. There were people all around them. They saw people all the time. News traveled fast. And you were known. You did your part for people who were less well off than you were. All of that is in the letters. The letters are not just replete with marvelous, eloquent words about country and patriotism and duty and the rest. They're filled with the details of life and a great deal of sorrow and grief and suffering. The letter, one point I'd like to make very quickly is that some of the lines, some of the quotations that are attributed to John and Abigail Adams, they actually were borrowing. This is a very interesting thing. They knew each other so well, and they knew what the other had read, and they knew the lines that the other liked or loved. So they would often use those lines in a letter without putting quotation marks around them, much the way that one might today say, somewhere over the rainbow bluebirds fly, or follow the yellow brick road. If you're writing to somebody very close to you, you wouldn't stop and put quotation marks around that necessarily. And in the famous letter of Abigail's, Don't Forget the Ladies, the next sentence, which is often quoted, and understandably, it's a great sentence. She says, "Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could." Well, that isn't her line. That's from a poem by Daniel Defoe. But he would do the same thing. When I was reading one of his letters early in my work on this project, I read this sentence and I thought, oh my goodness, what a sentence. What a mind, what a man he must have been. Because he was talking about the future and whether or not what was going to happen in this very dangerous revolutionary war. And he says, we can't guarantee success, but we can deserve it. Now, what a different attitude from our present day, where success is all that matters. Whether you deserve it or not is, not only secondary, maybe tertiary. And he's saying, we can't guarantee you will succeed, but we can deserve success. And when I read that, I thought, I found out that it's a line from Addison's play, Cato. Now, she knew that line. She knew he loved that line. That was part of Scripture, as it were, in their lives. Then I found out later on that Churchill used it too in the Second World War, and he didn't give credit to where it belonged either.
By the way, do you have a title for your new book?
No. Title is always the last thing for me, Brian.
We earlier didn't have our cameras on the portrait I wanted you to talk about,
yes.
Nabby.
Yes.
Adams Smith. Who was she, and what's the story?
Well, Nabby is a wonderful subject, wonderful story, and a marvelous, marvelous woman who is Abigail's daughter, their only daughter. There was one other daughter. They had 5 children, but only 4 survived. Susanna, who died in childhood, infant mortality. And Nabby was the oldest of the Adams children, and she was Abigail the second, but she was called Nabby. And she was a very lovely young woman who didn't quite have her mother's sort of spirit and assertiveness, but she had humor, and she was bright, and she was immensely admired and adored in her family. And she had a love affair. Was being courted here by a man named Royal Tyler, who was a young lawyer who moved into Braintree, and the family took quite a liking to him. He was talented, he was charming, he was handsome, but John, the father, was away in Holland and in France during the war, and the idea that this young daughter could be seriously considering marriage was hard for him to take, and then it became known. There was sort of talk in town and within the family that he had a somewhat dissipated past, and so the romance was put on the shelf for a while. In the old technique, the mother took the daughter off with her when she went to Europe, and the hope was that she'd have time to think this over. Well, that ended the romance but with Royal Tyler, and Royal Tyler went on afterward to become a playwright. He did one of the earliest plays produced by an American on the American stage in New York later, and he became eventually a judge and had quite an interesting career. In Europe, she met another young man named William Smith, and William Smith's portrait is also in the living room there. I don't know whether they are finding it at this point, but there he is, and he was an astonishing fellow. As a young man, he had been had a very distinguished career in the Revolutionary War as a brave and able soldier, and wound up on George Washington's staff. And you can see the suggestion of military camp life in the background of the portrait, which was by a young American painter named Mather Brown, who was living in London. And young Smith was sent over by Congress, chosen by Congress as one of the ablest young men around, to serve as the secretary to the American legation to the Court of St. James in London. So he became John Adams' secretary. And that's when he met Nabby and William Smith and Abigail Adams II, fell in love and got married. But it turned out that he had really a tragic life. He was never able to pull himself together and amount to much of anything. He wound up unable to keep a job. He was charged with some financial transactions that weren't altogether honest. He was acquitted. He wasn't, but he was a failure in most ways, and as a husband and as a father. It was part of the tragedy. This house, Brian, like any house of a family of many people over many generations, embodies all aspects of life. Great moments of accomplishment, great moments of exhilaration and happiness and family closeness, but also of death and suffering and tragedy and scandal, and it's the full spectrum of the human experience.
San Luis Obispo, you're next.
Thank you. I'm calling because I have a comment and a question. My comment is we live in such a society that is focused on entertainment that I think the play 1776 is such a good and is historically sound. So I would recommend all of the teachers show it to their students every year. And the really question I have is, you spoke of the integrity of the independence of Americans that we all feel deeply, and yet I feel today that integrity is being superseded by the mega national corporations, the merger manias, and their great contributions to the political parties, and that the employees of these companies see themselves more in common with their Japanese counterparts than they do with Americans. How do you think John Adams particularly would feel about this, and what would his comments be?
Well, his comments would be fiery, and you would have no trouble understanding what he meant, nor would he have the slightest hesitancy about annoying anybody. He would enrage many people today, because he always spoke his mind, and he could be tactless and he could be wrong, but there was nothing ambiguous about him. He would have found the role of money in American politics today, the role of influence peddlers, or whatever one wants to call them, abhorrent in the extreme. He would be brokenhearted by it. And, of course, much of it would be altogether bewildering to him. And much of it would be very exciting to him. It would be it would be a mistake to assume that he wouldn't understand our frailties and our corruption. He understood that corruption is built into the human condition. And he would say that this is one of the lessons of history. And if you don't understand that, then you are headed down a very perilous path, idealistic as it may be. On 1776, let me just agree with you. It's a very good play. It's historically quite fair, if not altogether accurate. One of the most interesting things about that play is it portrays John Adams as obnoxious. And in fact, as I recall, there's even a song about, "Why are you so obnoxious, John?" And in doing my work on what actually happened in 1776 in Philadelphia, I tried to find some reference to Adams as being obnoxious. And I searched through every letter, all the reports, all the journals that are known to exist, or at least that I've been able to track down. And I found no one referring to John Adams as obnoxious, except for one person. And that was John Adams. He called himself obnoxious, and he wrote that very late in life. And he said, I must have been quite obnoxious back then in my determination to drive this through the Congress. In fact, if you read the accounts that were written at the time, and one of them was on your screen at the start of the program, what you find is again and again they're all saying this was the most important man in the Congress at the time. This was the Atlas of Independence. This is the man who drove it through. And if he'd done nothing else in his whole life, nothing else in his entire career, he would be somebody we should all know about.
Just a couple blocks from here in the First Parish Church in the crypt area are the bodies of both John Adams and John Quincy Adams and their wives. And we have some videotape showing you that. You can visit that when you come to this area. Church actually is going through a remodeling, I guess, and I understand they're looking for support.
Yes, as so many historic sites are looking for support. And it's important to understand that just because sites are, for example, the property of a state or of the federal government even, that they are therefore being properly maintained. That is not always the case. These historic sites, like all old buildings, they need repairs, they need maintenance, and that's expensive, and that has to be kept up all the time.
I want to tell our audience, if you've just joined us, when you see this screen locking up like that, that's because the winds are fierce up here and we're having trouble getting our satellite picture out of here clean and clear, and we'll go back to some of that video in a moment so you can see how John Adams, Abigail Adams, John Quincy Adams, and his wife are all there in the same crypt area. Grove City, Pennsylvania, for David McCullough. Go ahead, please.
Homer Smith in Grove City. In 1933, my uncle picked me up in Arkansas and brought me to Wollaston, which is Quincy, Massachusetts, to a college where he was going to teach. I found it very inspirational to see the houses I passed every day when I went down Hancock Avenue, but I feel very lost in the fact that I never went over and visited them. I actually got my first job in 1933 in the Dorothy Quincy house. And she had some relationship to the Adamses. I'm not sure just what it was. Could you tell me, Mr. McCullough?
Yes, Abigail's, on Abigail's side, Abigail's mother was a Quincy. Over the mantelpiece in the long room here, if we could pick that up.
Actually, our camera's upstairs now.
Upstairs.
So yeah.
Over the mantelpiece is a portrait of Dr. Joseph Warren, who was a great patriot in Massachusetts, who fell in the Battle of Bunker Hill. And I wonder if our caller remembers going up to what was called Penn's Hill, which is right near this, near the sites of the original John Adams birthplace and the John Quincy Adams birthplace. And Penn's Hill is a promontory, highest promontory in this town, and on top of Penn's Hill there's a tremendous granite outcropping. It looks like a whale breaching up out of the hilltop. And when the Battle of Bunker Hill was raging, Abigail, with her children, her husband was away in Philadelphia, could hear the roar of the cannon and the blasts of the battle were shaking the window panes in her house. And her husband had told her, if you hear gunfire, if there's a chance the British are going to besiege this part of the coast, run for the woods, get out of town. But Abigail took young John Quincy by the hand. He was then 8 years old. And she went up to the top of Penn's Hill and climbed up on top of that rock and watched the Battle of Bunker Hill from the hilltop, the battle being about 10 to 12 miles away. And she wrote about that. John Quincy recorded it himself years later, this little boy who was President of the United States, saying, I saw the Battle of Bunker Hill. Some historians have questioned whether, in fact, she could have possibly seen the Battle of Bunker Hill, and some local residents have questioned it because if you drive up there today, there are houses around the site, and the trees have gotten quite large, and they say, well, she couldn't have seen the Battle of Bunker Hill. Well, one day there was a traffic jam out here on the highway, and one of the Park Service people, Caroline, was sitting at her desk, and one of the other staff people arrived late that morning and said, I'm sorry, I'm late. There's a big traffic jam out on the highway. And Caroline said, well, what's the matter? And she said, well, there's a fire in Charlestown. And Caroline kind of realized Charlestown is Bunker Hill. She got into her car, drove up to the top of Penn's Hill, climbed up on the rock, and she said she not only could see the fire in Charlestown, she could smell it. So the truth of this story was verified by one of the very good, conscientious Park Service people. Let me just say, Brian, that I know you have had some experience with this too, that the Park Service people, Park Service historians, all the sites that I've been to around the country, and been to plenty of them, are just wonderful and very good on their subject, their specialty. Some of the most authoritative and insightful help I've gotten from other historians has been from Park Service historians.
Next call, Yakima, Washington. Go ahead, please.
Hello. I'm kind of interested in what I'm hearing here. I really believe personally that every man is his own historian, and the writers, Mr. McCullough being a gentleman here, are very academic and everything, but if they'll look up the road, the people who are building history are ahead of them a fortnight or so. And I have an ancestor, Waitman T. Willie, which the gentleman may know, from West Virginia, and handed Abraham Lincoln on New Year's Eve 1862 the Willie Amendment, which resulted in us having Virginia split and into two states, West Virginia and Virginia. And Waitman served the first 8 years in Old Virginia, and the last 2 years of his life he served in West Virginia. And his father was William Willie, and he cleared 200 acres in West Virginia, and he died when he was about 94 with his just a day after his fifth wife. And I'm very intrigued with Waitman T. Willie. He had a year and a half of public education when he went north to Uniontown, Pennsylvania, and entered the university. And he had a homespun, and the other guy's little Lord Fauntleroy attirement. And in his third year there, they kind of made fun of him as a youngster. And in his third year, he was teaching Latin and Greek to the underclassmen. And it says a lot about education and a lot about the libraries. Waitman's father also, although a land clearer, had considerable library, Pilgrim's Progress, etc., as I understand. And I do appreciate your conversation here, and I appreciate the history of John Adams. I loved him so much in the old firehouse there. I loved particularly Patrick Henry, and the cousin of the president. Well, first man had said, we're all born free. He stood in the assembly and said, we're all born free. That was Patrick Henry. And the second man said, and we answer to no one but God. And so I felt in my heart a great sympathy for Clarence Thomas when they so lambasted him when he was trying to be a Supreme Court member. And thank you, sir, Mr. McCullough. I appreciate your being there this morning, and I'll attempt to look at your book. Thank you, sir.
That's a wonderful call, and several things he said really strike a bell with me. One is the idea of people who were supposedly backward or from the backwoods, who had no learning or had no appreciation of books. There's a kind of hubris about the present that we're superior in so many of the attainments of civilized life. Do you realize, for example, that the literacy rate in Massachusetts in 1799 was higher than it is in 1999? He mentioned Pilgrim's Progress. Pilgrim's Progress was read by most Americans who read anything. It was a book of immense importance to understanding Abraham Lincoln, for example, and of course the Bible. And one of the reasons the literacy rate was so high in Massachusetts is that you were being raised in a church, the Congregational Church, by and large, though there were some other churches, in which it was expected that you will know how to read so that you can read the Bible. The respect for education, it's one of the deepest, oldest, sustaining themes in American life. The idea that with education will come improvement, that tomorrow can be made better today if we just know more, and that we're less likely to be carried away by propaganda, by demagogues, by those who would use their power to take away our freedoms if we are educated. Jefferson said, anybody who expects a nation to be ignorant and free expects what never was and never will be.
David McCullough was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, graduated from Yale University in 1955. Will be with us for the rest of this visit we have here to the Adams Family Historical Site. And in a few moments, you're going to meet Abigail Brown, who is one of the Adams descendants. We'll find out about the Adams family reunion each year and how that works. We've got some videotape of the burying ground, which isn't too far from here, down the street across from the church that we just looked at. How many? Do you have any idea how many Adamses are buried over there?
No, but there's certainly more than 4 generations. There are probably 6 or 7 generations. It goes back to the 17th century. There are wonderful markers all through that graveyard. When John Adams rode off to Philadelphia in the dead of winter in 1776, riding away from here, temperature was in the 20s. There had been a Christmas snowstorm blanketed the whole colony. He and his companion, a young fellow named Bass, Joseph Bass, who was probably about 18, went with Adams. They were going to ride by horse all the way to Philadelphia, and then young Bass is going to bring the horses back, because you have to have the horses back home. There he is, Joseph Bass. Well, early in my work, I was thinking, how could I find out about Joseph Bass? I wonder if maybe he might be over here in the cemetery. And maybe I could find his grave marker. Well, I found it right away. That's probably him. Now, that doesn't mean that he was the only Joseph Bass, because the Bass family was a big family. He was a shoemaker, and he rode down to Philadelphia as Adams' traveling companion, servant, and, as I say, to bring the horses back. There's something so terrific about Adams riding to Philadelphia in the middle of winter. He wasn't a sunshine soldier. We think of transportation and communication as 2 different things. And one of the things you have to get over if you're trying to enter into the 18th century is to get over that idea, because in the 18th century, transportation and communication were the same thing, because nothing could be communicated any faster than a man on a horse or a sailing ship. Nobody ever knew when anyone was going to arrive anywhere. I say, when are you leaving, Brian? I'm catching the 2:15. Well, you'll be getting into Boston what time? 3:32. Well, they might be able to tell you in those days, I'm going to leave Braintree to come down to Philadelphia on January 26th. But when he might get there no one knew. You could run into any number of problems, including the fact there were no bridges between here and Philadelphia. Every stream, every river had to be crossed by ferry, and of course, if it was the dead of winter, they could be clogged with ice, and that could be a problem. So when messages were carried back and forth, and particularly when letters were carried back and forth, whether from Philadelphia to here or from here to Europe, you never knew how long that communication was going to take to get there, or if it would get there if you were sending it by ship.
As we said earlier, Abigail Brown, who is an Adams descendant, has been standing on the porch on a very breezy day. Hello, Abigail Brown.
Good morning.
How are you?
I am very well, thank you.
How do you descend from this family?
I am a seventh generation John Adams, John Quincy, Charles Francis I, John Quincy II, Abigail Adams Homans, Fanny Homans Mason, and me.
What has it meant being an Adams descendant?
Oh, it has meant so much. It has meant being part of this wonderful place and knowing it from the time I can remember. It means being connected to education and public service. It means being connected to history and to Quincy. And I've never spent a night in Quincy, but this feels like home.
Where do you live?
I live in Boston and mostly on the North Shore of Boston and Beverly Farms.
And how often does an Adams family group get together?
As a whole group, about once a year at the Adams Picnic in the fall.
Where do you do that?
Here in the carriage house and on the grounds.
There's a picture on our screen of one of your previous reunions. How many people get together when you do this?
Oh, it can vary. I really can't tell you, but it's a lot. Because we've now got probably 4 or 5 generations still alive.
What does it mean when you all get together? What do you talk about?
We talk about what's we're people. We talk about what we're doing. We talk about our connection to this house. We talk about how we can preserve it for the country and all the people in this country. Remember, this place, though it is very special to us, belongs to every citizen of this country.
Now, if you're a member of the family, do you have any special rights to use this house in any way?
I think we're allowed to be married here, but certainly there is a deep connection between the people who have worked here and the family, and we are always treated as if we are coming home.
Now, if you're an Adams descendant, do you have to think a certain way?
No. But you have the right to state how you are feeling.
Yeah.
And that goes, I think, with the territory.
David McCullough is here with us also. Have you met many Adams descendants?
Oh, I have, and you do have to think a certain way, it seems to me. You have to think independently.
That's correct.
You're not owned by anybody.
You have the right to think independently.
Yeah.
The privilege of thinking independently.
That's right.
Abigail Brown, is there an Adams that you're most fond of?
Oh, I like all of them for lots of different reasons. I was named after Abigail Adams, so I obviously have a very deep connection with her and a deep respect for her. And because I think of her, I am absolutely a feminist from the tips of my toes, without even thinking about it.
What party do you think Abigail Adams would belong to if she were here today?
Oh, I don't know that she would belong to a party, because I think she would be so absolutely independent in her thinking and would delve into the beliefs of both parties.
What for you is the Adams legacy?
There are several things. One, as I've said, is a connection to history and a belief that you must understand where we came from in order not to make the mistakes of the past. and an absolute, I heard David McCullough earlier talking about education, an absolute understanding that education is the most important thing that we can give to the future and provide for our followers.
Are you a reader?
I am a reader. I am a bookaholic. I don't necessarily rise to the level of my ancestors, but I love books for the sake of owning books.
Abigail Brown, thank you very much for coming over and joining us this morning.
Thank you.
And again, for our viewers that are watching the wind, you can see how bad it is, and these pictures are breaking up. I suspect that the minute we're finished with this telecast, the winds will have gone off. That's always the problem of
Well, you
television.
know, Mark Twain said, if you don't like New England weather, wait a minute.
For somebody just tuning in, let's go over quickly the Adams situation. John Adams
was a farmer's son from a little town outside of Boston, a little farming community called Braintree, now called Quincy. He was a member of the Continental Congress prior to the signing of the Declaration of Independence and at the time of the Declaration of Independence. He was a representative for the colony of Massachusetts. He was the one who urged that George Washington be put in command of the Continental Army when Boston was being besieged by the Continental Army. The British were holed up in Boston. He was also the one that encouraged and really worked to make sure that Jefferson became the author of the Declaration of Independence. He then went to Europe to serve in France with Benjamin Franklin. And he went on from France to Holland to secure an immensely important first loan to the United States from the Dutch Republic, from the Netherlands, which he thought was the most important thing he ever did. It was our first line of credit in Europe, and it came at a crucial point. Money was always of the pressing, urgent need. He then became, after the war, he then signed and served as a commissioner for the peace treaty of Paris that ended the Revolutionary War, an immensely important part of his career.
The portrait that we see on the screen right now.
Yes, there it is.
In this
famous beginning of what was to be a major portrait by Benjamin West, an American painter living in London. And there you see Adams in the left foreground with the sort of dove-colored suit on, and behind him is Benjamin Franklin.
And that's hanging in this library.
That's hanging in the library here. And Franklin and Adams, two very strong-willed men who had a lot in common, did not get along well at all together. And that's a whole part of the story that I find immensely interesting. Adams then became the ambassador to Great Britain, our first ambassador to Great Britain. After that, he returned to become vice president under George Washington. And then after Washington had served 2 terms, he was elected president. And in those days, the one who got the second highest number of votes, in other words, the runner-up, became the vice president, and that was Jefferson. So Adams, the president, had a vice president who was of the opposing party. So these two political opponents were locked together in the same administration. And when the Adams' term ended and Adams ran for his second term, he was defeated by Jefferson, who then served for 2 terms. Adams returned to this house, to where we are today, and in 1801, and stayed here, lived out the rest of his life. Meantime, his son, oldest son, John Quincy Adams, had become a figure of considerable prominence, mainly as a diplomat, and as a Secretary of State, and he became president, the only son of a president ever to become president, and he became president while his father was still alive, which of course is an extremely interesting and in many ways very touching part of the story.
John Adams was one of 14 men who served as vice president and then went on to be president. We are here at the Adams Historical Site, the home where they all lived, and we have our school bus here. We have the satellite uplink having trouble this morning. We have on the screen right now, you can see the actual home itself, and off to the left of that is the library where we are located with our little studio, a library that was built in 1870 by Charles Francis Adams. in which there are some 14,000 books. And we want to point out to you, if you are an educator, you are a teacher, and you want to teach this in your schools and want to connect with our C-SPAN in the Classroom organization, we'll give you a telephone number you can call at 202-626-4858. It's on the screen. Also, the website address is cspan.org/classroom. Again, the telephone number is 202-626-4858. Also, our cameras are in the Brooks Adams room. And are you aware of the story of the mastectomy of Nabby, which occurred in that room?
Yes, Nabby Adams Smith, John and Abigail Adams' adored oldest child and only daughter, contracted cancer of the breast, and the mastectomy was performed here in this room, her parents' home. She had come home to be with her mother when Nabby was so desperately ill, and of course it was horrible.
No anesthetic.
No, and terrible. This was in about 1811, and she lived for a few more years, died of the cancer, returned.
About what age?
In 1813. She would have been in her 40s, I guess. Maybe she was older. I have to do the math. She was a young woman, and she and her mother were very close. If you took all the men out of the Adams family story, or took all the men out of these houses, these buildings, just the life, the minds, the written records, the stories of the women would be enough to make one want to be here and know more about it.
Summit, New Jersey, thank you for waiting. You're on the air.
Hi, my question for Mr. McCullough is a political party question. You had mentioned earlier that Jefferson Republicans then became the Democrats were concerned with, one of the concerns was in returning power, keeping power in the states, as opposed to Adams Federalists, who it was important to them to have the federal government strong and maintaining the Union. And I just wanted to know if you felt that, in comparison with today's parties, even though Jefferson's Republicans became the Democrats, that might be more in key with today's Republicans in returning, in a general principle of returning power to the states, as the Federalists compare with today's Democrats in maintaining a strong federal government, if you thought that was a reasonably accurate depiction.
Well, the simplest analogy, but it wouldn't be very accurate, in my view, would be to say that the Republican Party of then it was the Democratic Party today, and the Federalist Party of then was the Republican Party of today, because along with a strong national government, the Federalists were more inclined to favor the development of industry, of trade, of commerce, of a national bank. And the driving figure for the Federalist Party in this period, after Washington's presidency was over, was Alexander Hamilton, one of the most brilliant and most interesting figures in the whole story. And one thing that Adams and Jefferson had in common, even when they were at odds with each other, was their dislike of Alexander Hamilton. And Adams had very good reason to dislike Hamilton, because Hamilton wrote a really scathing letter which became public about declaring that Adams was unfit for office, and attacking him for the kind of personality he had and his erratic mind and so forth. It was really, it was so outrageous, it was so savage an attack, almost out of the blue, against Adams, that it wound up doing Hamilton more harm than it did Adams.
John Adams is one of 6 presidents who attended Harvard. You were a Yale graduate. John Quincy Adams, Rutherford B. Hayes, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, and John Kennedy. Cameras in the bedroom of President John Adams, and if I recollect, wasn't this the room in which Abigail Adams died?
Yes, it's the room in which Abigail died. That is a bed that they brought back from their time in Europe. It's from Holland. Much of the furniture here is in the house is from either France or Holland or England because of the years that they served abroad. And many of the pieces of furniture and detailing of the house, of course, dates from later generations of Adams, who, after all, carried on their own lives and their own ways in this house. But that was also John and Abigail Adams' bed, as it was John Quincy Adams and his wife's bed. This house is like a geological cross-section. You can see all the layers, all the levels of history in a way that's not possible in other presidential houses, not possible in many other houses of any kind.
Coming up in a few moments, we're going to take this camera that you're looking at right there to the study. And it's in the study that David McCullough will tell us about the death of John Adams. And we're going to have these phones open here for the next few minutes for you to join in and talk to David McCullough. Our next call comes from Tucson, Arizona. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Yes, I was very interested because I referred to John Lucas's book on Undaunted Courage and Meriwether Lewis and the problem that Jefferson was handling in spending. I mean, getting the initial funding for supplies and expenses for the whole trip to Oregon, and his nemesis was John Adams, and they were trying to hold this from John Adams, and it came through the book quite vividly as the way Jefferson spent money, even if it wasn't his own, in comparison with John Adams. And I just wondered if you might comment on that.
Well, one of the ironies about Jefferson is that he kept personal records of every cent he ever spent. Everything. They're all meticulous record books that survive. We know what he bought, what he paid for it, all down through the years. And yet he couldn't stop spending money, and even when he was desperately in debt. In Europe, for example, he was buying paintings, buying books, buying scientific instruments, when he knew that he had no money to spend. And yet, in running the government as president, he was very good about not putting the country into debt. It was as if, while making something of a hash of his own personal finances, he was going to compensate, or at least show that he wasn't completely foolish in that way, by how he handled the national treasury. I'd like to make a point, if I could, about, we've been talking about teaching and education and books. That John Adams started as a teacher. His first job was as a teacher in a little school out in Worcester, Massachusetts, which was then pretty much in the wilds. And he never really stopped being a teacher. And many of his most eloquent and, for me, admirable letters are those to his children about their education, about what they should be reading, about why they should write, why they should keep a diary, what they should be reading. And he himself kept diaries through most of his life, unlike most of the public people of that time. Jefferson did not keep a diary. Jefferson did not write an autobiography. And of course, politicians, political leaders today rarely write letters or keep diaries. So we can know so much more about a man like John Adams. His diaries that he kept when he was keeping school out in Worcester are really wonderful. And they're in the Massachusetts Historical Society. And they're about the size of the palm of your hand. They're tiny little paper books, like little school notebooks. And he was always admonishing himself to improve and to straighten himself out and to be a better person. And I thought it would be great to, if I could, to just read you a typical entry from one of school teacher John Adams' diary entries. It tells us so much about what kind of a fellow he was. He kept school, he writes. This is July 21st, 1756. In other words, 20 years before 1776. I am now entering another year, and I am resolved not to neglect my time as I did last year. I am resolved to rise with the sun and to study scriptures on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday mornings, and to study some Latin author the other 3 mornings. Noons, nights, I intend to read English authors. This is my fixed determination, and I will set down every neglect and every compliance with this resolution. And then the next day he writes, fast day, rose not until 7 o'clock. This is the usual fate of my resolutions. He was perfectly human. He was always setting standards or goals a little higher than he knew he could reach, but he nonetheless did so.
When you work on a book like this, how much time do you end up being able to spend alone where you read and write, and where do you do that?
Well, I would say that more than half of the time is spent doing the reading and the writing, and in the thinking about what you're reading, and going over what you read, reading again what you read maybe 2 years before and seeing something in it that you didn't appreciate sufficiently the first time because you didn't know enough. Now, I'm very fortunate with this book because the great collection of Adams material is at hand in Boston, nearby, almost in my backyard. And of course, in working with a collection like that, and this is true for everyone who wishes to do research, you have the advantage of the staff, and the staff at the Massachusetts Historical Society are superb in what they know and how they can guide you and help you and what their judgment is of the reading and the thinking they have done about it. You know, I think one of the lessons of history is that there's no such thing as a self-made man or woman. Nobody ever does anything alone. It's certainly true of anyone who writes history and biography. You're immensely dependent upon, helped by, influenced, encouraged by lots of people who help you with the work of the reading and the finding things, trying to find things. One thing I do try to do is to go to the places where things happened. I really feel strongly about that. So I like to, my wife and I have been to Holland to see where Adams lived, to walk the walk, to be in the same streets where he was, to go places where, to go to the room in which he signed the treaty with the Dutch. The first treaty recognizing the existence of the United States of America by a foreign country. Except, of course, for France, but this was an immensely important thing to be in the same room and look out the same window, which is one of the effects that one has here in this house. These are the desks at which he worked. These are the windows through which he looked, and in many ways the view is not greatly changed. These were country people. He's always worried right up to when he's an elderly fellow retired here about his hay crop and his fruit trees and how the plowing's going and the care of the horses and the chickens. And this is a country place, though, of course, it's grown up a great deal around it since.
Want to make sure our audience knows that at the end of this, we will have a chat room with Celeste Walker of the Massachusetts Historical Society. That's if you're watching this live. And that's on our AmericanPresidents.org website. And that's just like it sounds, AmericanPresidents.org. And you can find the chat room coming up at the end of this. Again, we're having some transmission difficulties, so it's hard for David McCullough to see what we're going to show you next. But we have a camera in the actual study. Tell us what the study is. I'm sorry you can't see it here, but what's in the study?
Well, you come into the study, and it's a big room. This is the half of the house that Abigail added to the original house when she and her husband were President and First Lady. And I mentioned earlier that both Adams and Jefferson came home from Europe and doubled the size of their house. And Abigail designed this wing. There you see the fireplace, that she was had her clear ideas of what she wanted in the way of a fireplace and marble around it and all the rest. And she did it without her husband knowing about it. And she wanted it done without him knowing about it because he wouldn't be interested, she said, but I think she also wanted to do it herself without his getting involved. And it's so different with Jefferson, of course, who comes back, and everything at Monticello has to be done exactly as Jefferson wants it. He, the great architect and designer. So you have two decidedly different ways of enlarging your house.
We saw this, actually, this desk earlier.
Yeah, if you go back to the desk, now that desk came from France, was brought home by the Adams. It has rosewood and all kinds of fine woods built into it. It's a gorgeous piece of 18th century furniture. At that desk, and that's one of Adams' books, those are his glasses, is where he wrote his letters to Thomas Jefferson beginning in 1812 right through till 1826, the year of their death. They wrote over 300 letters to each other, all of which have survived. And I should point out, however, that Adams wrote to Jefferson twice as often as Jefferson wrote to Adams. And there's one point, it's really wonderful, where I think it's about a month and a half, 2 months period, where Adams writes to Jefferson 12 times, and he still had no answer from Jefferson. And he writes in the 12th letter, he said that, don't worry about that, because one of your letters is worth 4 of mine.
We have some video from Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, where he actually sat and wrote his letters, as you can see right here.
Now, each of these men lived with their books and their writing desk. Now, here you see the bed that Jefferson died in, same day that Adams died, in that same room that we just saw here. This is the room where Jefferson died, and there is his desk at which he wrote his letters to Adams. And I believe if the camera moves far enough, you're going to see a bust of John Adams watching over Jefferson's shoulder. There it is. Now, whether that bust was there when Jefferson was alive, whether he had it in that room is not known. But he did want to have a bust of Adams with him.
And this was, they died in 1826.
They died on the 4th of July, 1826. Jefferson died about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and Adams died 5 years later in the house here in Braintree about 6 o'clock. And if we could possibly go back to that room, I want to show you.
This is the chair where he supposedly was sitting?
No, he did not. I don't think he died in that chair. It's really not. There's conflicting evidence. It's hard to imagine that he died in the chair. He almost certainly died in a bed that was in this room.
By the way, you said 5 years later. You meant 5 hours later.
5 hours later. 5 hours later. Same day. And he is reported by a granddaughter to have said his last words were, "Jefferson survives." Adams is saying, "Jefferson, I'm dying, Jefferson survives." That chair is where he made he last received a delegation of townspeople who came to call on him to get a statement from him about the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, the 50 years since the 4th of July in Philadelphia, 1776. And he was sitting in that chair, and they came to him and they asked him if, and he and Jefferson both had been asked to make some kind of a statement. But what do you feel? What do you have to tell the country at this momentous anniversary? And Jefferson wrote a long, really quite eloquent piece, labored over, edited, rewritten. He really worked on it, and it's quite eloquent and quite Jeffersonian. Adams didn't write anything, but they came to him and said, "Mr. President, don't you have something to say?" And he said, "Yes, independence forever." And they said, "That's all?" He said, "Not a word more." There it is, independence forever.
Bold Spring, Tennessee, for David McCullough. Go ahead, please.
Hello, Brian. Thank you for the C-SPAN network and the programming.
Welcome.
Mr. McCullough, I'm concerned about what I call the killing of our American heroes. Do you think or believe that there is a faction within or outside of the United States whose goal is to destroy the heroic perceptions of people we were taught are American heroes? Or do you think we were not told complete truths about our American heroes because some of the topics would have come out were not mentioned in public at the time I was in school or college. I am a grandmother.
Well, the writing and the teaching of history, and of course how a society remembers its heroes, changes from generation to generation. For a long time there was sort of the great man theory of history, which of course meant to a large extent great white man theory of history, but that there were these luminous figures that were the telling events of times past, and that we should know all about them and why they were so admirable. Now it's more that the pendulum has swung almost as far as it can go the other way. It's not just that some historians or some writers of biography and teachers of history want to show that these people from the past had feet of clay. It's as if they want to demonstrate that they were nothing but clay. They were all clay. Of course they were all imperfect. Of course they had their times of transgression or failure or lack of foresight, kindness, virtue, whatever. But it's a matter of degree. I think the fact that these people were human beings makes those who achieved greatness all the greater. Should make them all the greater in our eyes. And it is absolutely true that there have been great figures in our past, and who did determine how history turned in many ways, and that we ought to know about them, and that some people just stand out in any generation, and stand out nearly always for good reason. I don't think there's any conspiracy to denigrate, to bring down the heroes of the past. I think there's an indifference to the past on the part of our culture. We Americans have always been entranced by the future, which has been part of our vitality. You know, we greet each other by saying, "What's new?" We don't say, "What's old?" But you can't know who you are unless you understand where you came from and how you got to be where you are. And a society can suffer from the consequences of a kind of amnesia, just as an individual could. I think that history ought to be taught and ought to be considered as a larger way of looking at life, as an extension of the experience of being alive. Why cut yourself off from all that's known about other times and other people? Why have blinders on to think that only now is the most interesting and important time? And why fall a victim to the idea that we are somehow closer to the angels than those who preceded us, that we are superior? To look down on people in the past as somehow being stupid because they didn't have all the technologies, let's say, that we have. You read those letters. You read the letters written by Abigail Adams at her table in that little house, written with a quill pen, after she's struggled through the day with the farm and with her children and with sickness and with worry, sitting at that table by the fireplace with a candle and a quill pen, writing those marvelous letters to her distant husband, which might or might not actually wind up reaching him. And to say that we, with our computers, our word processors, are somehow an improvement on that is to be in a state of delusion.
Our producer for this stop here in Quincy, Massachusetts has been Maura Pierce. Technical setup run by Tom Aldridge. Back home, Mark Farkas, our executive producer for the series, and Brett Betzel, our director here in our school bus. We want to thank the Media One cable system here in the Quincy area for assisting us in getting this altogether, and Marianne Peak, who is the superintendent of the Adams National Historic Park, and her staff for their great cooperation here on site, and Celeste Walker with the Adams paper, who will be involved with our chat room in just a few minutes. For the moment, though, we have a call from Los Angeles, California. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning. I had a question, whether you've seen that movie about the Amistad, and whether you could comment upon whether it's historically accurate. And also, you mentioned that Adams and Jefferson had a significant amount of correspondence. I wonder if they ever discussed that incident, and whether the subject of Sally Hemings ever came up in their correspondence, that is, between Adams and Jefferson. Thank you.
I have not seen the film. I've seen the clip of Anthony Hopkins delivering his speech in the courtroom. I thought that his portrayal of John Quincy Adams, and certainly the makeup job that was done, was superb. However, that wasn't what he said. Now, what he said in the film, as I understand it, was really quite fine and appropriate and in keeping with the actual oration of John Quincy Adams before the court. But I don't understand why they didn't use the real thing, because the real thing is so powerful. Now, it's only, I don't know, 10, 12 minutes in the film. It went on for 2 days. Also, it could have been filmed in the actual room in which it happened, but the filmmakers came and looked at the actual room, which is down in Hartford, Connecticut, in the old Capitol building in the heart of downtown Hartford. And it's preserved precisely as it was, but they decided that isn't the way it ought to look. So they didn't use that room. The issue of slavery, the issue of the Sally Hemings story is, of course, of immense importance to understanding Jefferson and to understanding how Adams responded to slavery and to the accusation of the story when it came to light. The man who broke the story was James Callender, the same James Callender that we were discussing before, who had been attacking Adams, who had assaulted Adams with really a vicious and largely untrue screed. Callender, who had been working with, and one might even say for, Jefferson, had been jailed because of the Alien and Sedition Acts, the Sedition Act being the great mistake, the tragic, awful misstep of the Adams administration. Adams had not necessarily favored it, but he had signed it, and it was under his during his presidency that it happened, which meant that if you attack somebody in the government, particularly certainly the president, in an irresponsible, defamatory way, you could be put in jail. Callender was put in jail. He was released by President Jefferson, but when Jefferson refused to do any more for Callender, Callender turned on Jefferson, Callender then working for a newspaper in Richmond, and broke the story that Jefferson had as his concubine, one of his slaves, Sally Hemings. Now, the story had been gossiped about before, but had not been in print. It immediately broke into print, and particularly here in New England, where slavery, anti-slavery sentiment was very strong. Now, what's interesting, particularly in discussing John Adams, is how did he react to that? How did he react to the story? And what he said, I think, is so powerful and so acute. He said, whether it was true or not, he didn't know. But he said, in effect, that stories of that kind about slave masters, Virginia planters, are inevitable. He's heard them, John Adams, have heard them for as long as I can remember. And the reason that they are inevitable is that such a story is a metaphor for the large sin the large immorality of slavery. Not adultery or keeping a concubine, but slavery. Slavery is the ultimate immorality.
David McCullough, we're out of time, and we want to make sure that everybody knows that our next stop in our presidential series is Thomas Jefferson's home in Monticello on April the 2nd. We want to thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, and thank you for coming to Quincy and to this great site.
And again, for those who've just joined us, your book on John Adams will be out when?
Oh, within the next 2 years. Let's be that. I can't be any more specific than that.
Thank you very much for joining us. We've been in the Charles Francis Adams Library here, built in 1870. It's where our studios have been, right next to the Adams House, which is outside the door. And it's open for visitors from April 1st on here in Quincy, Massachusetts, just a short 8-9 miles from Boston and not much farther from the Boston airport. Thanks for joining us.
Tomorrow night at 9 p.m. Eastern, C-SPAN continues